Hey everyone, I'm Angela Lynn.
And I'm Jesse Lynn, and welcome back to another episode of But Where Are You Really From?
Today we're talking about how crazy tipping has gotten in the US. I don't think you need to have left the US ever in your life to feel like tipping has gotten crazy over the last few years. But also then if you've ever spent time abroad, you realize almost nowhere else does tipping, and certainly not to the degree that the US has, where default in a lot of places is 15 or 20% as the starting basis. So yeah, we're going to talk today about how and why we think all of this has gotten to this point and what we think about all of it. Tipflation, y'all. Let's go.
Just before we get started, we believe everyone should get paid a fair wage. So this is not to say that people who are doing gig jobs should not get paid fairly, but some of the tipping behaviors and practices have gone way crazy. And one of the areas that I've really noticed it is in delivery services. If you remember when Seamless and Grubhub first came out, it was basically just aggregating every delivery person that restaurants were already paying for to deliver food to your doorstep. And it was really nice because then you had a nice listing of where all the restaurants were, and people would come deliver to you for free if you hit a certain order amount, right? And now it's turned into a situation where there are regulatory charges to help bring workers' wages up to a certain level, but services are still charging you for the service, and they are not decreasing your fees to use the service. So I have DoorDash, for example. I'll read to you a receipt that I recently of an order that I purchased on DoorDash. The food was $16.85. There's a regulatory response fee of $4.99, so $5. The delivery fee is $0 because I pay for DoorDash. Service fee, $3. Dasher tip, I gave them $1.50 because I feel the regulatory response fee gets paid to the Dasher. But I was first of all, the food is very expensive already. And then there's basically $5 to $10 of fees on top of that for the food to come to you. It feels kind of a ripoff at this point.
It's definitively a ripoff. Food delivery is a special little snowflake in the broader topic of tipping, because it's not just tipping, it's a bunch of other fees and hidden fees. Because when you were oh, my DoorDash fee is free, but then there was a $3 service charge. I'm the fuck is the difference between the DoorDash service charge that got waived and the one you paid? Food delivery is just whack, because all the fees are opaque. We don't really know what each of those things mean. You said something about regulatory whatever. I'm I have no idea what that even means and who really is receiving that. You were I think it goes to the delivery person. I was I don't know that based on the name of that fee. So food delivery is pretty crazy. And honestly, you can't really escape it when you live somewhere where you don't have a car. But if you live somewhere with a car, for example, in California, half the time when I go through the whole process and it gets to the checkout page, I'm I'm just going to drive there. This is absurd. I'd rather spend 10 minutes of my time to drive there and pick it up myself and not pay for all this shit. And still, I probably still tipped the restaurant, because the topic today is actually tipping, but the food delivery stuff is a whole other ballgame, because I do still tip the people who work at the places that I'm picking up the food from, even if I physically go myself. But I'm avoiding all these unknown charges that DoorDash and all these other services are adding on.
Yeah, agreed. I think a lot of those fees are meant to go to the gig workers so that they're getting paid the minimum wage. And then if they're at that level, then I don't feel I need to tip as highly, because there's already basically a mandatory fee baked into what they get paid for the position. But that's not the only place where I have kind of reduced my tipping behavior. If I'm going to a coffee shop and I'm ordering a basic brewed coffee, I think during the pandemic and the couple of years after that, I would be a little bit generous with the tipping, because it's just kind of everyone's suffering, spread the wealth, right? But then after that, I was kind of just living in New York City, there's never a service aspect to anything. No service workers are happy. So you're always any service interaction is just plain miserable for everyone involved. So you're already inclined not to tip. And then it's when the person is literally just pouring me coffee, I'm I don't really know what I'm tipping you for. Like, there's not really anything complicated or complex about you giving me coffee. Like, I could literally do like an Amazon Go where it's like I just scan and like pour myself the coffee. It's like the same thing.
Yeah, you mentioned so many things. I'm not sure where to take this topic. Earlier, you mentioned blah blah tips, fees to help them get up to the minimum wage. I think that concept is so American. As you know, I'm constantly now trying to think more globally because I've lived abroad and I'm going to move abroad in the next 2 years. That concept is not common anywhere except the US, that like the consumers are expected to pay some sort of respectable wage as opposed to the employers. Everywhere else in the world, for the jobs that they are doing, people are paid for their work. I don't know when in US history it became common that service work was always paid like nothing or like cents for an hour, and then the rest was like made up for in tips. But it's so American because you go anywhere else, and like, you know, when I first went to, for example, Spain, I was annoyed with how slow the service was. But at the same time, I was like, I mean, I don't have to tip them and they're still nice to me and they're, you know, like they're still getting the job done. You mentioned that in New York, there's no service element because everyone's just mean and like grumpy the whole time, right? It's not just New York. New York is like so exaggerated though. Everyone is always in like a default shitty mood. But in the US, a lot of service workers by default are not like the happiest people, and it's often because they're not paid very well. And ironically, now tipping has become this more like default thing that people do regardless of how bad the service might be and their attitudes might be towards you. But then when you go abroad, for example, like I always talk about Japan, but I'm in Japan right now, the service is amazing in Japan, okay? These people are paid minimum wage and they are so polite, they're so friendly, they're always smiling at you, they're always trying to be helpful. So it goes down to like there's motivational aspects and then there's like cultural or societal aspects as to why service in and of itself cannot be good when there's not a tip being like dangled in front of someone's face. And then like why on the flip side has it become that in the US, tip, which has always been a surplus optional thing, has now become essentially not optional. It's like required. And then you don't get anything better for it. Like you really don't, because you probably still get the same shitty attitude. And if anything, something that I hate about the US now in service work, I hate going to restaurants where the server is so overly fake ass friendly to you. Like you can tell they don't give two shits about you. They're being like fake nice to you, but so like acting wise too. It's like really over the top. Or then they're like really pushy about like adding wine or like other expensive things to make your bill bigger so that they get a bigger tip. It like oozes out of you the real motivation behind all of your like things that are coming out of your mouth. And I hate it. It's like so disingenuous, as opposed to like, again, abroad, right? Restaurants, not just Japan, everywhere else outside of the US, if you know, like you don't always know the portion size of whatever you're going to order. If you over order, they usually tell you like, hey, that's too much. Like you guys have already ordered like enough things. I think this will be too much food for you. They have no incentive to make your bill bigger because their wages are not dependent on the tip based on the bill size. So everywhere else besides the US, they will tell you like, that's way too much food. You should just like cut one of these things. Versus in the US, they're like, yeah, add on the cheesecake, add on the wine. And I'm like, and when it comes out, I'm like, this is for like 20 people and we're like 4 people. Why did you make us buy this? I could go on so many rants about this, but like those were 2 directions that I definitely wanted to bring up, because it's like, one, it should not be on the consumer to make sure that the person doing the work is paid a respectable wage. And 2, like the fact that service does not need to be tied to whether or not there's an incentive of tip or not. But for some reason in the US, it is. And also you get shitty service.
Definitely on like the food delivery front, where it's like, if you're charging the consumer for using your service, that should cover everything for the service, including the person who's doing your delivery. And I think everyone will agree a tip is supposed to be something you give when you receive service that you feel favorable about, right? You're like, this service is very good, or like, I really like the conversation that I had with this person. It's not meant to be like, I always give a tip. But I feel like that's 100% like what it's become. Like everywhere you go, people are asking for tips, and it makes you feel like an asshole when you don't want to give a tip.
Hey listeners, wondering how you can support us? The biggest way is by increasing our visibility by following us on Instagram at Where Are You From Pod, on TikTok at But Where Are You Really From, subscribing to our YouTube channel under But Where Are You Really From Podcast, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, and telling your friends. The more people we can get to listen to the show, the more we can continue spotlighting different perspectives and stories. And if you feel so inclined, we're also accepting donations at buymeacoffee.com/whereareyoufrom. Thanks, y'all. Let's delve into that, because I truly believe that culture of the consumer being seen as an asshole for not giving tip or not giving enough tip in someone's mind has been getting like worse and worse over the years. But I really think the like inflection point was the fucking iPads. Was Square. Sorry, Square. It's always Square. It's the fucking iPads powered by Square, where like they flip the goddamn iPad around and they're like, oh, you'll just keep tapping through the screens, or like choose your selection, but they're staring at you while you're choosing the fucking 15, 20, 25% or whatever. Sometimes I've seen some crazy shit where it's like 20, 25, 30. I'm like, what? But anyways, the fact that this iPad exists and is now the like default point of service interface for so many like coffee shops, restaurants, stores, even, you know, like not even food or beverage things, like literally a clothing shop or whatever. iPads have now become the main way that merchants are doing their business. And so there's this like default screen with the tipping, and it has made things so much worse because there's this new pressure on the consumer to tip or feel like an asshole because they're literally staring at you as you choose that option. And you also feel like you need to go fast, right? Because the fastest option is to click like a pre-selected thing. But like, for example, sometimes for me, I'm like, oh, they were nice, but like, why should I tip $5 on this like 10-second interaction because I thought you were nice? Like, if you want to give an appropriate tip amount, for example, when cash was still a thing and people had tip jars, right? Like you'd often just throw like the rest of your change in there, or like $1 if you were feeling really generous, right? So like sometimes I've started doing this where I actually take the extra few seconds to click custom amount and type my own tip in there. But like you can feel that people are annoyed with you when you do that because it slows everything down. But it's like, can we just remember that like when tipping wasn't based on like cashless payments, it was seen as like a really nice thing when you threw like all of your change into the tip jar. But now it's all based on a percentage of your total. To your point earlier of like when people aren't doing anything, right? So like storefronts, right? Like things where like there's literally no one is doing anything for you. I went to a bakery. I got a pie that was sitting on a shelf, and she took the pie and rung it up. And I still had the fucking iPad presented to me with the tip stuff. And I felt like an asshole if I didn't tip. So I tipped like the lowest, which was like 15% or whatever. But it was one of those like boutique bakery things. So then I tipped her like $6 for grabbing a pie off a shelf. I'm like, that's just your job. That's like a normal ass job. That's what you're paid for. But for some reason, I felt obligated to pay you $6 for doing your job. These aspects have gotten way too crazy and I hate it.
I will say something interesting is that the scaling of it is quite subjective. And I'm thinking about like where I feel a tip is merited. It really depends on what the person is preparing and even the kind of business. So like my local coffee shop that I know is like a small business, I'm inclined to tip people there more for the same thing than I would be for like a Starbucks, because I'm like, Starbucks is a giant corporation. Like they should be able to afford to pay their employees like a fair wage, versus like a smaller shop. I'm just like, I want to keep this business afloat. So even those like decisions around how to tip, they're qualitatively subjective. I'm deciding based off of like how I feel about a particular business.
Of course. And that's what tipping is supposed to be. Tipping is supposed to be subjective anyway. It's not supposed to be objective. It's based on how you perceive the service that you received. But for some reason, it's not related at all anymore to the level of service that you received.
Agreed.
One last little rant I'll go on about the iPad situation. This is like me just shitting on Square. Sorry, Square. No personal offense towards this company. It's just the fact that Square has, for better or for worse, made it really easy for like all small businesses to be paid with credit card, even with their like iPhone, right? So I recently had the situation around tipping where I was like, I feel really icky about it and I don't know what the right thing was here. So my parents needed to change their water heater in their house, and water heaters are really expensive. So I spent like a lot of my personal time reaching out to multiple vendors to price bid and all this stuff, because that's like the normal thing you're supposed to do. We agreed on like this price all in. The guys came and they installed the water heater. They did a good job, whatever. And I was like, okay, I want to pay by credit card. He's like, cool. So he plugged in the Square thing, and then like it literally showed up the tip page again. And I was really confused at that point, because I was like, the cost of the actual service was over $1,000. So I was like, am I really supposed to be tipping 15, 20, 25 was like the default settings. The guy was like looking away to give me like a little bit of privacy, I guess, when I like went through the page. But because there was no comment around it, I was like, I guess this is normal, but I felt really gross about it because the actual dollar amount of the tip was huge, because it's based on the cost, which was honestly, it was close to $2,000. So I clicked like the lowest amount, but I still felt really gross about it. And then it went through, and then the guy was like, that's like a really big tip. Are you sure you want to do that? And I was like, what? Now you tell me it's like a big tip? Because I feel like you should have told me that before like we even got to this page. It should have been like, ignore the default stuff because obviously those are crazy. Put in your custom amount or whatever. And so when he said that was when I realized like, okay, this is insane. So then I was like, wait, then can we like go back? Is there any way to like go back and like, I'll still tip you, but like I'll adjust it to like what I would have tipped you if this were a cash payment situation? And he was like, I can, or he thought he could. And then he was like, oh, it looks like the thing already went through. So then I would have to like call my company to get it refunded to you to do a new transaction. I was like, you know what? Forget it. That's like my mistake, I guess. But I felt really bad because it was also my parents who paid for it because of their house. So it was like my mom's credit card. So then I offered to pay her half the tip amount because it was so much money that I felt so bad. And so then that point I was like, these iPad things have gotten out of control, because even for this kind of stuff, it's like integrated in there. And I feel like for services where it's like hundreds to thousands of dollars, like they need to fix the tip screen to be custom or not at all or whatever. But it just makes it so that it's so much more confusion between the consumer and the like service provider. And then it just makes me feel like I have so much pressure and also like achiness regardless of which choice I decide to go with.
Well, listeners, you can tell that this has been quite a heated episode, and I know tipping in general is a very hot topic between family, friends, and such, so we'd love to hear what your experience is. Again, we have a very specific coastal travelers experience, so maybe you have a completely different tipping experience. Maybe you don't find it onerous, you have a different perspective. We would love to hear from you.
Also, I would love to hear from people who work in service, because obviously you do need the tips to live a decent life, but at the same time, like, you're also consumers. Like, even if you work in service, you're a consumer yourself. Like, do you feel like the current system is a good system, or would it be better if, for example, like the employers just paid you a livable wage and tipping was like eliminated, or some other option C that no one has thought of? Definitely, we've only been talking about it from the consumer end, so very interested to hear from people who work in service and what you think about all of this and how it's all changed in the last like several years. And speaking of unnecessary tipping, but truly only if you feel like it and you've been enjoying our podcast. You can tip us on Buy Me a Coffee. We have a Buy Me a Coffee profile or whatever. Honestly, anything is very nice and not necessary, but we certainly appreciate it, just as tipping should be. So if you need the link, it's in our link in bio on like all of our socials, but I'm pretty sure it's just buymeacoffee.com/where are you from. So find us there, and thanks for listening. Come back next week because we will have another fresh episode for you then. And until then,
再见 bitches.